And off we go.
Okay, welcome everybody to this Future Teacher reactivated session. Well, reflected. I'm getting my R's wrong. Reflected session on designing appropriate assessments. And for those that are new to Future Teacher, hopefully you're seeing my screen sharing here, and we've run this session and lots of the previous sessions 2 times previously, and this is the third running, and you'll be able to access the main resource that we used and also the recordings from those 2 previous sessions on the page I'm scrolling up and down of. Then there's a panel at the top that shows you a little bit of information about this session, about your main host for today, and then a little panel here for each of the guest speakers who will introduce themselves, but where we've got a link to a presentation, you'll also be able to access that during or after the session as well. As I said, this is the third running of this topic, and this is topic 14. If you look at the drop-down menu, there's many more, and the next one is on technology enhanced programs, and the registration form is already available for that. So you can sign up during or after this session to the next one if you're interested. And also, if you're interested in speaking on designing for technology enhanced programs, we'd be keen to hear from you. But back to today and appropriate assessments. And I think, Lillian, were you going to summarize what people said they most wanted to learn from this session?
Yeah, so just very briefly, obviously we had over 200 signups for the webinar, so I expect there'll be still people joining, but on the whole, people were keen to find out about how they should redesign assessments, you know, in the age of AI, but just generally with all the other principles coming in around good practice as well. And developing more inclusive practice in assessments, including assessment optionality, and examples of student co-creation, what that looks like, what creative assessment means. And of course, you know, people are interested in how to persuade colleagues to redevelop and redesign assessments, because that's not something we can take for granted. We're probably preaching to the converted in this audience, and some of us will want to take it back and speak to our colleagues about these ideas that we're going to learn in the session today. So yeah, those are some of the things that people want covered, which our speakers will definitely speak to. Okay, so I think without further ado, what we're going to do is introduce you to our first speakers, who are Miriam Firth from University of Manchester and Jan Ball-Smith from University of York. And they're going to talk to us about the project that they've been working on called Optionality in Assessment. And I think that's a very interesting topic. I think if we want to colleagues to diversify their assessments, what do we mean? What does that look like? What are student impressions around all that? So without further ado, I'll pass you over to Miri and Jan.
Thank you so much, Lillian, and very warm welcome from myself. I'm Miri. I'm just going to start sharing my screen so that you can all start seeing our presentation. But again, firstly, a huge thanks to everyone at Future Teacher. It's such a pleasure to be here with you all today. You have got access to our presentation slides already on that website. I'm Miri. I'm from the University of Manchester, and I am the academic lead for assessment. And I'm presenting here today with one of my project partners, Jan. Jan, to you for an introduction.
Hello, I'm Jan Ball-Smith. I'm Head of Apprenticeships and Inclusive Learning at the University of York, and I'm a member of the collaborative research team.
Thanks so much. So as you can see, colleagues, this particular project is across 4 universities within the UK, and we are particularly interested looking at student choice in assessment. So we're going to give you a little bit of an overview of our interim findings today. I haven't got a huge amount to go through because they are interim findings. We have a conference and reports that are coming out shortly. those will be the things where you can find out our full findings and our recommendations to the sector. So today is very much an overview and an update on where we're up to at present. If you're interested in our project, we are funded by the Quality Assurance Agency, which is one of our core governing bodies in the United Kingdom for higher education. We are funded by the Quality Assurance Agency through one of their collaborative enhancement projects. So the QAA every year have this call out and say, is anyone wanting to do a piece of research across a number of universities looking into a particular area? And our universities got together and decided we were interested very much in this area around options in assessment and student choice in assessment. And it's just been, it's a great project, isn't it, Jan? We've got over 40 colleagues across the 4 universities working in this. So it very much is across sector, not just case studies from one institution. So please do use that QR code. I checked it just before we started, and it should work and take you through to that QAA page there. But I'll hand to Jan now to consider why we did this project to begin with. So to you first then, Jan.
Thank you. So as Miri says, we've been defining optionality in assessment as around student choice in assessment. And that can take many forms, including the type and timing of assessments and options in terms of different methodologies. Assessment optionality could have particular benefits as part of inclusion, offering more agency to students in their learning and potentially reducing the need for reasonable adjustments and alternative assessments for disabled students. To ensure that assessments are inclusive for different groups of students, we need to think about what we can do differently. Assessment optionality could be one way of doing this. So that's what this project is focused on. Very much fact-finding, pulling together literature and case studies, and looking at policy and practice in a UK context. Next slide, please. Sorry, forgot to say that bit. So we had 3 key research questions. We looked at academic and student opinions on the feasibility, practicality and utility of assessment optionality. And what I would say is academic includes, so it's staff and students, so it's professional services, staff perceptions as well. What the current practice is and opinion on the use of assessment optionality across the 4 institutions, and how we can better empower and enable colleagues to design and utilise effective and appropriate options in assessment. And we've done that in a variety of ways, and Miri will talk through the research aspect in more detail, but including surveys and focus groups. So what have we learned from the literature? We started with a literature review to inform the project. It's difficult to generalise from the literature, as the studies were carried out in very different educational systems and contexts and different disciplines, and they interpreted optionality in different ways. And I think that's one of the things to consider, is that student choice and assessment can mean many things. So we've learned that context is key. We analysed a range of findings from the literature under 4 themes, which inform the questions in the staff and student surveys. So the 4 themes being the potential benefits for students and staff, institutional considerations, potential drawbacks and barriers for both students and staff, and the different types of optionality or choice within assessment. I think that's me done, and I will pass back to Miri.
Thanks so much, Jan. So York very much led on the literature review, and a number of colleagues from across the project had those key tasks. But as I'm sure you can imagine, doing ethics and sharing this across all 4 universities during a time when not only did we have a marking and assessment boycott, we had strikes, we had all sorts of things going on. So we're actually just delighted that we've got through and got all of this data. And today I'm delighted to be able to share with you some of our interim findings. But as I've said, colleagues, we are writing up, we've just finished the first draft of our first report, which is over 30 pages long, that takes all of that data, analyses it and provides recommendations to the sector. So today is really an interim update for you to whet your appetite, to see if you've also had similar experiences across your institutions as well. So what's interesting so far? As Jan said, we started with a staff survey. So we shared this out across all 4 institutions, and all staff were included. So all professional services and academic staff. Of our academic staff, a third of them said that they had used some form of choice or optionality in their own assessment design, and of that they had used it for both formative and summative purposes. In terms of the most used form of optionality in assessment, negotiated task was the most, and the least was then the assessment criteria, which strikes a lot of interest across colleagues, but also a lot of fear in terms of, how would we then create that? How could it be possible to have options in assessment criteria that would still map to the same learning outcomes? Thank you, Alistair. How many minutes is that, and which bell was it?
That's the cowbell. You've got 6 minutes left.
Oh, fantastic. I love it. I've never had a cowbell before. This is delightful. So one thing that they said, as you can see on the screen here, this direct quotation we took as just as an example, our colleagues, and obviously we don't bear a huge amount of weight to this, but we just felt it was important to share this as an interim result, that colleagues wanted to do options in assessment because they wanted their learning to make sense to them. That our colleagues who designed options weren't doing it out of their pedagogical curiosity or academic practice curiosity, but it was driven via a need in a sense of wanting to make sure that the learning styles and the passions of their learners were being met by this assessment, that it wasn't just always an exam, it wasn't always an essay. So it was really lovely through this project to understand those motivations. And as Jan quite rightly said, we did do this as an exploratory study because there hasn't been a study like this before, not only nationally, but internationally. We've sought to find the answers and they weren't there. In terms of some of the comments, the critical comments, I think the one that's highlighted there here in purple is one that would be obvious. Is it potentially a nightmare in workload? If you are going to have a piece of assessment with a range of different options, how on earth would you plan to mark that, and would that result in more time needed? So that was interesting from our staff survey. In terms of our student survey, and I think firstly it's interesting that whilst a third of our academic staff said they had intentionally designed optionality in their assessment, 50% of our students said, yeah, I've had a form of optionality in my assessment. So there's that was interesting to us in terms of, well, we needed to then do interviews and focus groups, which we finished over the summer, to then go, students, why are you seeing it more potentially than our staff? What's interesting there in terms of how are you seeing options compared to our colleagues? And again, you've got some quotations at the bottom of the screen here in terms of why people might not want to offer it from students. So students saying that maybe the quality of degrees might be degraded, but that it could then suit particular learning styles. In terms of the most frequent seen forms of assessment, so we asked our students what the usual forms of assessment they had, and the top ones were essay, exam, presentation, and blog, I think, then came forth. So very much from their position, they were having very similar assessments as their forms of assessments offered to them. In terms of the choices, the choices that they saw most frequently, it was around the negotiated assessment, which was the same as our staff. So, for example, when you have an exam and you have a question that says, please choose question 1 or 2 to answer. So it wasn't fully negotiated assessment, but it was more of a standard approach to options in assessment that students accepted that they'd seen and had witness of and had completed. So that's what's been interesting so far, but we are interested in your opinions as well. So if you've got any examples of options in assessment, Jan and I have already presented this earlier on this year, and it's enabled us to be aware of so many more policies across the sector, case studies that we're interested in that we're then able to utilise and feed into this project. We have the QAA event in November where we're not only presenting the contents of the report, so giving the recommendations to the sector, but we're also showcasing the case studies from across our institutions so that you can see how we have navigated this in practice. Some of it is outstanding, excellent practice. Some of this is emerging practice because people are interested and they're developing their practice in options or student choice and assessment. But everyone is welcome to our QAA event in November. It's free for all QAA members, and it's also open to students. So we are doors completely open on this. We want everybody to be able to be participating and engaging with us on our project. There's a couple of references for you there if you're interested in the background review that we completed. And before I turn to any questions, and I think we've got time for a couple today, this is just a huge thanks to the colleagues across this project team, the number of administrators and academics who's been working on this since last summer, Jan, I think it was last June, July that we actually started initial discussions. So a huge thank you and a nod to all the colleagues across this project. You've got Jan and I today, but it is by no means just us working on this. So thank you so much for your time on that. I didn't hear another bell, so I think I've done well there.
You've done very well there. Thank you very much. And in fact, we're going to allow a couple of minutes now because Miri and Jan are going to have to disappear for a teaching commitment soon, so they won't be here at the end for the discussion bit. So if there are any questions, have we seen anything in the text chat so far?
Yeah, Mike has a question. Mike, you're not shy. Would you like to come on and just ask your question?
Yeah, sure. I've got a bit of a concern. I put it in the chat, but to get around accessibility issues, some people might think, oh, trying to make all these accessible, I'll give them one accessible option, just like, you know, you go to a restaurant and there's one vegan choice on the menu. Is there a concern about people doing that?
Good question, Mike. And I always like a catering metaphor. I studied catering for many years. It hasn't come through in our analysis, and I haven't heard that concern raised so far. In terms of it being an accessible versus inaccessible option, no, I haven't. But Jan, have you heard of anything through your review?
Yeah, I think probably one of the key things is about ensuring that students have the same grounding in all of the different types of assessment. So one of the things that can happen is that we add in something that might be a more novel or new form of assessment, and students don't feel that they have the same literacies or the same kind of skills development than they would have for an exam or an essay. And then that can become something, you're right, it can become something that's a bit of an add-on. So I think one of the things that's come through with the project is around ensuring that if different forms of assessment are used, that preparation and the skills development is embedded from the start.
And I do think Nicola's just popped in the chat. It's really important to take a programme view as well, because we're not advocating every unit has options. You know, it's absolutely not what this project is about, and is one of the things that we fronted every part of our assessment data gathering. Sorry, it was, you know, there's no mandate here. There's nothing from us that says you have to have options in your assessment. But because we wanted to find out what the practice is, how feasible is it, what are colleagues doing, what are the practicalities, what are the issues, that's what's just been so brilliant to be able to consider. And it is potentially a place to start, as Tracy's popped in the chat. You know, starting one place might lead to lots of exciting other things. And the one thing we've seen certainly over the last year is you've got optionality in assessment, student choice in assessment, negotiated assessment, flexible assessment. There's lots of terms that can link to this. We're not interested in creating a new term either. We're interested in understanding the practice of this from both student and staff perspectives in order to support the sector.
Maybe a final question, just in terms of moving on to the next speaker. Rob put in a question about interested in hearing about the equivalence in marking when there's student choice and actual assessment. Do all students do the same assessment at the same time, or variations within a block? I'm assuming that's a big question that can't necessarily be fully answered, but do you have any specific insights?
Go on, Jan.
Well, I can give some insights from the literature. So I think that very much depends on, this is why it was difficult to compare across different educational contexts. So in some programs and in some countries, there's much more of a focus on being able to select which assessments you do and at what times. So there would be that that negotiation. So you might have 10 different assessments available, and as long as you hit this many points within the marking criteria, you could do that in a number of different ways. But I think one of the things that this project has explored is just the huge variety of different types of optionality and assessment. I would say that came through in the literature more in terms of North American university systems rather than in a UK context.
Okay, that's great. We're really grateful for you, especially I know you've got to rush off now for the teaching. So Lillian, do you want to introduce our next speaker? Thank you very much, Jan and Miriam. And I'm sure there'll be other questions, people contacting you as well off list.
Yeah. So if anyone's not managed to have their questions answered, yes, please feel free to email to Jan and Miri. I think they left their email address as Flexible Learning. Is that right, Jan? We'll pop it in the chat. But our next speaker is Eddie Cowling, who happens to be at the University of York as well, representing, if you like, a specific cohort of students, our kind of almost pre-university, not all of them are, some of them are pre-master's students, but it's the International Pathway College anyway, is what they're called at the University of York. Eddie's the assessment lead there, and I've been after him as a speaker for, I don't know, about 2 years now, Eddie. So at last he said yes, and it's very timely because he's been doing quite a bit of work as the assessment lead, looking into how they can practically deploy some of these principles around assessment, and there's more principles coming out all the time. You know, it's like a checklist that just keeps growing. How do you take that practically and try and implement that, especially with the growing concerns around AI? So over to you, Eddie.
Thank you, Lillian, and thanks, Jan and Miriam. Let me just try and share my screen. Okay, can you see my slides there?
Yep, that's great.
Super. Okay. Well, yeah, thank you for having me along. So I'm trying a tool called Gamma today for the very first time, which probably is a bit stupid considering there's 100 people on the call. So if I struggle, bear with me. But yeah, just to give you a bit of context, then, as Lillian said, our department, we provide pathway or preparatory courses to international students entering university study at both undergrad and postgrad levels. So we have multiple objectives and demands from various stakeholders, whether that's around language acquisition, English for academic purposes, but teaching and assessing academic content knowledge across various disciplines, but also preparing students for the culture and the context of British higher education and British life. So inevitably various challenges from and remits, I suppose, from an assessment perspective. And yeah, Lillian has asked me to talk today a little bit about a project that we've been working on recently in our department, and that is the design and development of a set of principles of assessment. It functions as guidance, as support, a kind of resource bank for staff. And I'll explain the design approach and why I think this can be a worthwhile process and get buy-in from staff. I'll touch on the next steps regarding implementation, very much acknowledge that this is a fluid and essentially never-ending venture, as Lillian alluded to, hence the title, Forever a Work in Progress. But finally, kind of off the back of the demand of the audience that I saw in your sign-up forms, I'm going to showcase a couple of assessment methods that we're trying this year, which have been considered with the principles in mind, but also with the obvious challenges around generative AI. I think it's important to note, we hear the term good assessment, effective assessment. I'm forever using these myself, but I think it's important to remind ourselves that objectively, good assessment, sound assessment arguably does not exist. As Brown and Knight say, it's much more useful to be talking about fitness for purpose. And it's the same around validity. The idea of a valid assessment in itself does not really exist. It's more about maximizing validity for a specific purpose. And with this project, it's with that in mind that I've been very keen to approach this with kind of the rhetoric around meaningful assessment. So a much more personalized, inclusive approach, developing students academically and developing kind of assessment for learning as well as of learning, preparing students for the outside world, which in our context is not only the real world, but it's also their future university study, their destination department. So just the whys and the hows for this project then, as I say, for us, it's there's a myriad of kind of levels of disciplines, of backgrounds, and that's both staff and students, staff as well with this. And one of the principal aims because of that was really to provide a bank of resources which aligns to university expectations and standards really that can support staff design and develop assessments that work. In turn, that will be another way of developing assessment literacy across the department, a more kind of common understanding of what assessment is for. And of course, in turn, should improve the chances of a consistent assessment experience for students, but and overall, you know, encouraging good practice and assessments that are fit for purpose. I will go into a bit more detail about how we went about this for those that might be under a similar kind of remit, but I'll tell you about how it was research informed, experience informed. We wanted to use what we had learnt in the past, the things that did work and the things that didn't work, and crucially tailoring it to our students in our context, in our department. The short-term aim was very much the development of a resource, a bank of resources that can help start conversations to get that kind of staff buy-in and staff understanding around assessment, generate ideas and supporting staff adhere to kind of wider expectations and standards. The longer term, I really want to explore how these kind of principles can be used in certain decision-making processes, perhaps things like evaluation and review, end of term reflection processes, that kind of thing. So in kind of, yeah, for anyone with a similar remit, anyone wanting to develop their own principles or just interested in kind of what's out there, I thought this might help. So of course, how we went about this, I wanted to ensure that we were kind of aligned to the long established principles of my own institution. Now I know all universities are quite different with regards to this, but for us at York, and I hope my York colleagues on the call don't mind me saying this, but for our kind of overarching broader university principles, they are quite limited, they're quite vague, quite generic at times. And, you know, for our colleagues and myself looking at these and thinking, well, you know, what does this mean? What does equity mean? How do I go about achieving that? Is quite a difficult question to answer. So, you know, I wanted to build on those and provide something which actually helps practically to meet those principles. Of course, as always, nosying into other institutions and other departments and contacts is always useful. Speaking to other people, and certainly I'd be more than willing to do this outside of this call with others interested in this area. Learning from the literature of experts, some of these names you might be familiar with. I will add links. Thanks, Alistair. I'll add links onto these. But also specific to our field, for me, language testing and EAP. And relevant bodies and organizations, yes, they were useful, but also more than anything, just to check that what we were doing was aligning and reflecting with sector guidance. So things like the QAA assessment guidance was absolutely crucial. I'm sure you will notice at this stage we are yet to directly involve students, much to my shame. There's a lack of co-creation, there's a lack of consultation at this point, but this is certainly something that we want to look at in the future. I think for preparatory courses, short courses with international students, it is a bit more of a challenge, that involvement. It's not an excuse, but it's something we're going to be looking at in future. So our principles then, bringing all that input together. What are our core 8 principles? They're underpinned by constructive alignment, and we make sure we get that message across to staff. But they address essentially inclusivity, assessment for learning, validity and meeting outcomes and standards, feedback and marking systems, manageable loading, authenticity, fairness and reliability, and technology enhanced practice. Nothing groundbreaking in itself and earth-shattering in itself, of course, but what we've been keen to do is provide to staff what that actually means. You know, what does that mean in practice for us in our context? Theoretically and pragmatically, how does one go about achieving this, and signposting to internal and external resources that can support you in meeting those principles and those aims. Now, having looked this morning at the responses from the registration forms for today, there's clear demand and appetite to discuss and address the generative AI issue dilemma. I think it's reasonable to say that AI has or will impact all of our principles. For many staff, the perception is that it threatens, but of course, I think there are opportunities there as well. I think in many ways, everything has changed and nothing has changed. All our principles of meaningful assessment are still valid. They're still as relevant as ever, but of course, undoubtedly, how we meet some of those principles, I think, are going to change. So along with the principles in mind and AI, I just want to spend the very last part talking and introducing and outline really the case for interactive oral assessments and how we are using technology to kind of supplement that practice. So for anyone unfamiliar, the idea behind IOAs, interactive oral assessments, it's a genuine two-way conversation. It's giving the student the opportunity to verbally demonstrate their understanding of the learning outcomes. They're very flexible in design. There is some crossover with a traditional Viva, I think, depending on the design and the objective, but they're often seen as scenario-based, you know, often linked to previously submitted work or a simulation, for example. How are we finding that these meet the principles, our principles of meaningful assessment? Well, considering we've had contract cheating, now we've got generative AI, obvious concerns around integrity and authorship, it can be an engaging approach to authenticate assessment, but also, as these guys argue, you know, the strengths there around authenticity and inclusivity. So when deciding on this as a method, we will review our principles, look through our principles, discuss, decide where there are risks, where there are gaps, in order to decide on this an assessment method. And one of those big ones, I think, one of the risks, one of the gaps with interactive oral assessments is, of course, scalability. You know, larger numbers of students, is it feasible? The marking involved, the timetable, the staffing involved. And I think technology perhaps can help here. A method we are trying this year is asynchronous video oral exams. So we're using a university-supported video interview platform to conduct oral exams or assessments asynchronously. And people on the call may have experience using such an approach, much more than me, and fantastic if so. I'd be really interested to share ideas on this. So these tools generally are used just so the one that we're using is one called Shortlister. They're used generally by companies across industries to ask questions of candidates via pre-recorded questions, and these can be personalized to individuals or groups. Candidates are then given a link. They can then complete the interview at a time that suits them, but within a set time frame at a place of their convenience, and then the managers, or in our case, the markers, can then review those recorded interviews at a convenient time. The benefits, so, you know, how are they meeting our principles of meaningful assessments? Well, I've been liaising with an employability manager at York, and they often encourage the students to use these platforms for interview practice for the real world. So I think there's a huge potential here for assessment purposes, whether that be formative or summative. I think there's strengths there around inclusivity and fairness. There's personalization. It gives flexibility. It gives a bit of optionality, as we've discussed, to a student. Supporting academic integrity. I would never claim this is a panacea. I don't think any method is to eliminate, you know, involvement of AI. But of course, it can help. It can help. The timeframes, it's up to the assessment designer to choose those. So, you know, there is real ways that it can limit opportunity to rely on AI. Authenticity and employability, as far as the world of work is concerned, there's obvious appeals there. And I think, you know, the big one is it makes oral exams manageable for markers, which certainly for our guys is a real biggie. So it's early days for us on that. And if people do have, oh, thank you. I think I'm pretty much done. Yeah, it's more of a watch this space on that method. But if people have ideas or have experience on that, I'd be really interested to hear more about it. And we'll be reporting back on that as well. Was that my final bell, Alistair?
That was your final bell. Well done. Well done. Thank you. Yeah, we did ask Eddie to do a couple of minutes extra because we'd had so many people asking about the AI element, so we did want to expand that out a little bit. So thank you very much. Again, any questions you have, comments you have, pop them in the text chat, and then Eddie will address them over the next 20 minutes or so, or we can discuss them when we get to the discussion bit at the end. So for our final speaker, I am going to introduce Catherine O'Mahony. I may not have pronounced that rightly, Catherine. So deep apologies if I didn't. And you can instruct me as to what I should have said. But Catherine's been doing some great work with her colleague Laura Lee, looking at helping staff kind of become really familiar with UDL principles applied to assessment. And they've created a course for staff, a badged course. So without further ado, I shall pass over to you, Catherine.
Well, thank you very much. Delighted to meet you all. And I am presenting on behalf of my colleague, Laura Lee, who is led out in this work. So I hope I do it full justice. So I'm the director of our Learning and Teaching Centre here at University College Cork, and there's a really rich learning and teaching culture in the institution. We've been in place since the early 2000s, and about 60% of our academic staff have completed a formal professional qualification in teaching and learning. And universal design for learning, that idea of creating increased flexibility in the design enactment of curriculum, is to support the needs of all students. That's a cornerstone of our program. So it's already very well embedded in what we do. But the need for something on inclusive assessment became apparent because while staff were, beginning to make changes in their teaching, small shifts in their teaching approaches, where the rubber hits the road or the challenges is often in the assessment design. We can often default to the norms of the discipline. There can be kind of conservative practices within departments and schools. And it was really, I suppose, helping staff not only understand and feel a bit galvanized on what they wanted to do in terms of bringing in flexible or more inclusive assessment practices, but also knowing how do we actually navigate the institutional systems, curriculum committees, approval processes, etc. So it was trying to cover off everything and provide the right supports at the right time. So here's Laura, who's led out in this work. She's our Learning Enhancement Project Manager, and she worked very closely with Siobhan O'Neill as a Research Support Officer in CERTL as well. So the design, as I mentioned, was based on participant feedback from an existing short course. We call them digital badges, essentially a micro-credential, which we offer for kind of thematic areas in professional development in our university. So they wanted specific support here, and we got funding to develop this. And it's part of a broader suite of continuing professional development available through UCC, such as our year-long programs and the short courses. So there's two pathways. They can, just audit the material that are shared in our virtual learning environment Canvas, or they can complete assignments and actually gain a digital badge as an endpoint. And I suppose institutional culture is different from place to place. In our university, digital badges, micro-credentials have great currency. And we have a new national framework around micro-credentials, and it's something that people are persuaded are worth their time and see the value of. So when designing this course, it was really, I suppose, recognizing that there's multiple kind of junctures or areas which staff need a little bit of framing around understanding this approach. So what I'll share here is actually what kinds of information is helpful and what stuff does staff need to be aware of to support them in making these choices. So we talked about universal design for learning. We shared practice examples, case studies, academic integrity, really exploring that idea and the kind of the virtues and the principles that inform it, and then navigating the assessment processes in the institution. So what is inclusive assessment? It's practices that engage all students, allowing equity of opportunity and allowing you to choose flexible methods to address those barriers. It's got multiple principles. It's about making assessments accessible, removing the need for modification or accommodation, scaffolding, helping building blocks of learning and assessment, having variety options in how students demonstrate their understanding, and providing students the opportunity to express their learning in different ways. And then allowing for performance improving feedback. So really good principles that we would have in place around feeding forward, feeding back, so students can actually make those changes. They're all really relevant for when we're thinking about inclusive assessment. And you mentioned the idea of authentic. That's really important as we're all trying to align, I suppose, programs and learning with responding to grander societal challenges. So assessment design, the constructs, we're actually testing things that are meaningful and that can bring into future world of work or future world as just citizens in the world. So we're familiar with some of the barriers to inclusion, but we consider these relevant on kind of three main pillars, which is the subjectivity, which is that kind of cultural aspect, which is something also to consider in terms of inclusive assessment, the accessibility, which is a very physical intentional lack of connection with the actual ability to complete the assignment. So that could be some student that has maybe an undiagnosed learning disability. And then the integrity, when we make a choice that maybe removes one burden for us as assessors, how does that impact on the student in terms of what they're facing? So it's looking at the unintended consequences of assessment design. So I had intended to play a video, but I think I'll just keep moving. So why is inclusive assessment important? In the Irish context, we have an increased access to education and increased diversity amongst our own population, such that 25% of our students now in our university are coming through non-traditional pathways. Research shows that students from these diverse backgrounds may have poor assessment outcomes due to assessments not providing the range of opportunities, physical challenges, difficulties with literacy, or challenges to the amount of time. So these are a number of things drawing from the literature. So when we talk about universal design for learning, there's three pillars, which is engagement, action and expression, and representation. And the action and expression is the one that specifically links into assessment. So to what extent can you modify your materials so that they're varied but also accessible? To what extent can you design for options so students have voice and choice in terms of how they might represent their learning? And then how might you actually scaffold skills so that students become more autonomous, self-directed learners? And that can be things like highlighting expectation, providing rubrics, feeding forward, feeding backwards, so they know how to improve and adjust their teaching or their learning. So in the design of the course, we went into these things in detail, and I just wanted to kind of share some kind of learnings that were particularly useful. So we talk about the 7 steps to inclusive assessment, which build on what we've been talking about already, which is having good assessment design principles. It should be constructive aligned, clear, transparent criteria, timely, constructive principles, all of those things there. A variety of assessment methods, incorporating choice, designing for inclusive exams, so considering your scheduling, your method, whether it's open or closed books. And this is a really important thing in terms of the assessment construct. When we set a 90-minute paper, written paper, are we actually testing for biological understanding, if that's the topic area? Are we testing writing speed, the ability to retain information for a very short period of time and regurgitate it onto a paper? So what's the actual construct around our assessment, and is it fit for purpose, like some of us have mentioned? How technology can assist, how do we actually prepare, engage, and support students, particularly students that maybe because of the COVID impact has increased their anxiety around exams. So there's actually a lot more preparation and steps to try and reduce anxiety, and then also monitoring, reviewing and sharing practice, so that we don't see our assessment as an endpoint, but something that we continually go back to and try to improve. So we collected up a number of case studies as part of this course. Here's one from a colleague in occupational science and occupational therapy. I think there's about 16 different case studies represented here. So we're trying to always show the institutional context, variety of disciplines, variety of approaches, just to inspire staff and get them kind of looking at small incremental changes. So you mentioned things, we talked about the principles at the start, so these emerge then in the case studies to show the diversity of ways that people are implementing those principles, like also bringing in students as co-creators, scaffolding, providing choice, working on real world tasks. And then similarly, some of these other things are actually deeper topics. So academic integrity, we signpost here, but we point to a longer course that we actually provide for staff, as well as a course that we provide for our students around academic integrity. We provide additional resources such as short guides and assessment on in the age of AI. And these are all links that I can provide you with. So it's just to see that we might have a focus here on inclusive assessment, but there's a broader, deeper conversation that has to happen around a range of things. And then moving on to navigating the UCC assessment processes, really clarifying and highlighting the systems part of this, the curriculum committees, the paperwork, and the actual windows of time that you need to do that work. So people can plan maybe a year out where it might be something more substantial. But our guidance is always start small, guide incremental changes, see these as small tweaks that you might be doing over a couple of years. Take risks. Yes, assessment is the point that is maybe a little bit scarier or less room for that flexibility, but sometimes it's about trialing a small thing, seeing how students are getting on, and that might galvanize you for future changes. And then the aim of our course is not to our lecturers are our experts. They're our disciplinary experts. They set the papers. They know what their students need to learn in order to achieve in a course and program. So we're really trying to just give prompts and guides to help and focus the mind and thinking and empower people to actually make some of these choices. So thank you for your attention. And if you want to follow up with anything on this, you might connect with my colleague Laura Lee. And if you wanted to come back and share more about this, we're launching it soon, I think in mid-October, and we'd be delighted to give you feedback a year out when we have a sense of how staff are doing when they're engaging with this program. Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine. That's excellent. And you're 2 minutes ahead of time. So I wonder if in those 2 minutes you could say something about the way you also gave staff within the course, you gave staff some hints and tips for negotiating almost the bureaucracy of improving or changing your assessment. Do you want to say a little bit about that?
So when you're in our context, there is a couple of things that you need to do when you're making an assessment modification. So there's a system that you need to update, which is then published module outline for the whole program. But to get to that point, you first need to bring it to your local curriculum committee and have it discussed, and people give kind of feedback if it's necessary, or sometimes it's just for noting. But that window for making changes only opens between I think it's February and March. So there's a lot of pre-work that people need to do to get to that point, to have had those decisions made. And sometimes it can feel like the system is set up to say no to you because, there's so many options on the drop-down menu. There's so many options and if you're trying to do something innovative, it can feel like a little bit of a very structured box that you might not sit into. So what we're saying to people is sometimes it's using more for the formal representation, that you're using more flexible language so that you're not in that box, that you might be able to say there will be a formative assessment, and then you have more flexibility as the course designer to, in this, maybe modify it as you're going along, seeing how you're responding. Because that students as partner piece hits up against this issue around having to design assessments a year out and not having flexibility. So providing kind of a little bit of language to them around, well, you could call it this, that gives you this amount of scope. And if students feed into that process, you might be able to make some of these changes.
That's great. And I think a real key takeaway when I was looking over the course with Laura was that you had thought about that in advance, because you can get staff really excited about changing assessment, and then they hit this brick wall of what are the hurdles and the loops that I have to jump through in order to then get it kind of ticked off by all the relevant committees and things. So the fact that your course covered that was very impressive to me. So Anybody else thinking about let's do this at our university? Do think about those practical bureaucratic things. Okay, thank you very much, everybody. So we now come into the discussion time, where we can look at the questions. And anything specific, Rosemary, Ron, Lillian, that you've spotted?
Well, I put a question in for Catherine, but she literally started answering that question straight away because of what you prompted, Alistair. And I'm certainly like, I put in some feedback as I was watching your presentation, Catherine. I want to steal the whole thing, you know, from the UDL course and the micro-credentials, and then introducing that vocabulary across the whole, you know, academic landscape, and then introducing the alternative assessments or the flexible assessments. Suddenly I was thinking that wouldn't it be lovely to have a bank of these ways of phrasing your assessment to give you that flexibility further down the line. And again, you know, I'm kind of thinking, ooh, that's something I could do at my university, where I could look through each module learning outcome for some of those statements, and then interviewing lecturers on what actually were the actual assessments that they designed, so that, like you say, you know, when people are thinking about these things, we don't have to invent them all over again, but it would be nice to have a bank of them for easy access. But that was a lovely presentation. Some of the questions that I found in the channel, and I think Mike and Eddie have been having a little discussion on the chat about the use of these technologies for practicing or delivering these oral assessments. I don't know if Eddie, you want to come on and say anything about that?
Yeah, I can do, and I could just to add a bit of a response to your latest question on there as well, Lillian, if I may. But yeah, no, Mike was just asking just about the kind of video oral assessment that we were discussing on my presentation, about how you can ensure that students are not cheating, which of course, yeah, inevitable, a question, understandable question, and as I said, you can't with I think with any assessment method you can't, but I just was clarifying really to Mike. So with that system, it is essentially in a way a live recording of the student's immediate response to questions put to them. The questions, of course, the question design is crucial, and it would work in some contexts but not others. But these systems, the pre-recorded question is given to the student, and they're expected to respond to them immediately or within a brief thinking time that the system gives to them. I'm happy if anybody wants to discuss these more or see it in practice, I could show them off the meeting. I thought your point though, Lillian, in there about with AI still in mind about university structures and the kind of bureaucracy and the changes that we have to go through to modify assessments, I think is so important, because I think going into the new challenges with generative AI, that is something which I hope our institution at least will kind of take that on board, because I think we need to be more fleet-footed when it comes to bureaucracy. We need to be able to take risks, and we need to be able to change things quicker than we can. And I hope that in the way that modifications have to go through, and I know this happens elsewhere as well at other universities, in this day and age when we want to take risks and we want to try new things and experiment, that bureaucracy and the kind of red tape and the process it takes to go through the approval process, I think needs to change.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. Yeah, it's always the systems that allow us to operate on, you know, with more flexibility or not. But Catherine has something to say about that.
I was just going to respond to the bureaucracy. I think also, now this might be right, just pertinent for my institution. We can sometimes blame the system, and we can sometimes blame accreditation bodies. And there seems to be a lot more flexibility and willingness when you actually engage with and have those conversations. So we had people saying, oh, well, the Dental Association will never allow that. And ask them, talk to them, and highlight why, and make a case for things. So sometimes it's about reaching out. Yes, it adds more work too, but if you're going through a program review or something substantial, or if there's kind of more direction from a kind of department head, then you've got a really good rationale for bringing forward these changes. Otherwise, we keep getting stuck in the same spaces where the system says no, and we need to maybe be active in changing that mindset as well.
That's a very good point. I think where you have some of those flexibilities, it's definitely one approach. I know we tried with things like accounting bodies, and they want the students handwriting in an exam hall, and that's it. They refuse to give you anything else, which is very, very frustrating. But I think you just have to keep at it, don't you? As well. You have to drag them kicking and screaming into the 21st century. We're already nearly a quarter of the way through the 21st century. Oh my God, we're living in the future.
But it's also worth challenging sometimes, because I know from a further education context where my background is, I remember situations where somebody was told they could not do that kind of assessment with the students. It had to be a written assessment. And we were in a room of us on a training event, and somebody just said, "Oh, what awarding body are you with?" And they said, "Which awarding body?" And somebody else said, "Oh, my external examiner for that same awarding body says it's absolutely fine. I've been doing that for a year." So it's always worth pushing back if you're talking about those external things.
That's brilliant. I just want to revisit some of the other questions, and Miri and Jan aren't here anymore, but perhaps our speakers could weigh in on some of these discussions with their experience. But I know Rob was asking about what if students focus too much on things that actually aren't, if you ask them to do a presentation or a blog post or something else, they can get quite mired in the presentation quality or something that doesn't actually evidence their achievement of the learning outcomes. And I think it was Tanya as well wanted to ask what people thought, did students and staff say anything particularly around fairness with choice and optionality? Because if a student chooses to create a 3-minute video about, as a submission, as opposed to a 3,000-word essay, people get that wrong impression that it takes me 3 minutes to look at that. It must be less work. But yeah. Catherine?
Yeah.
So one thing we actually share with the participants in the course is exactly that, like, how do you as an assessor judge the workload aspect of all of those things? And that same point of, if students are being asked to do something new, do they have actually scaffolded skills development to do it well? So that's where rubrics come in terms of supporting students, but also giving students, not only the assessors, a thought of, okay, well, how is this going to be different in terms of workload, but that you were relating that to students as well. So when they make those choices, they can go, well, I know that my essay would take, this kind of work. These are the type of rubrics I should be working to. So in a way, you maybe need to not provide every choice ever that ever was possible, but rather curtail it a little bit, because then you can give guidance into, like you would have with a really well articulated, constructed essay, there's a clarity of presentation that's relevant, and those kind of things transfer across, but giving students a sense of what's the workload kind of payoff between those tasks. And I can actually share in the link some guidance that I have on that at a national level.
Yeah, that would be really helpful if you could pop a link in there. We've just been asking, Lily and I have just been pestering Emma as well, because Emma's got some work on equivalencies that they offer students, written words versus spoken minutes, etc.
Yeah, I've certainly been collecting rubrics in my spare time whenever I come across another rubric on the internet about how to judge, blog posts as opposed to podcasts, as opposed to any of these creative assessments. And I've been pulling those together as much as I can as well, because it is easier for you if you can kind of see another example of how that might be possible. And that's one way to kind of, I guess, encourage colleagues, start with the marking process, and work backwards. Or it's almost like starting with your learning outcomes and designing, isn't it? Ron's asked us all to try and share what one thing you'll take away as a result of attending this webinar, share it in the chat. I want to bottle Catherine Omahaniev and take you everywhere with me with every conversation I have with colleagues about assessment. Absolutely very inspired by that. I'm lucky that I have people like Eddie and Jan at the University of York who are pushing the boundaries or trying to incorporate all these assessments. But yeah, I'm curious about other people. And before we close our recording, you know, it would be lovely if you could add in the chat what your current experience is in your organization in terms of trying to diversify assessment, any resources that your university has. If you could share it in the chat, we'll share that on the website, which will allow this entire community to benefit from those experiences. And I want to say a big thank you to our speakers. Two have disappeared, but I'll send them our thanks. But Catherine and Eddie, thank you so very much.
And thank you to all of you for turning up as well. And we will hang around for a little bit. We always hang around for a little bit afterwards to pick up any discussion, and it's normally a smaller number by then, so we can, you know, for anybody that can stay on, we can open up microphones and chat a little bit. I'm afraid I have to give my apologies because I've got another meeting starting at 2 o'clock, but thank you very much for being here. It's been great to take part. I shall see you later. Bye.